Chloe Jensen never expected to find Chicago's most dangerous crime boss slumped in an alley behind her workplace at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by men who wanted him dead. But what she did next would put a target on her back and change both their lives forever. Chloe's feet ached as she pushed through the back door of the Sapphire Lounge, counting the meager tips from her 10-hour shift. It was the same routine she'd endured for 3 years: double shifts, endless exhaustion, all to chip away at the $87,000 in medical debt her mother had left behind. At 24, she'd long forgotten what it felt like to dream about anything beyond survival. "Please, just leave me alone," a slurred voice echoed from the darkness of the alley. Chloe froze. She should keep walking. In this part of downtown Chicago, you didn't get involved in other people's problems, especially not at midnight on a frigid November night. But something made her look. 3 men in dark coats surrounded a figure slumped against the brick wall, a whiskey bottle dangling from his hand. Even in the dim light, Chloe could see the distinctive rose and dagger tattoo crawling up his neck, the mark everyone in Chicago knew belonged to Caleb Hayes, the Mafia boss who controlled half the city's underground operations. "Caleb Hayes finally shows weakness," one of the men said in a thick Russian accent, pulling out a knife. "The Volkov family sends its regards." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. Every logical instinct screamed at her to turn around, to pretend she'd seen nothing. People like her, poor, powerless, invisible, didn't survive getting involved in mob business. But as the man raised his knife, Chloe noticed something clutched in Caleb's other hand, a photograph of a young girl with dark hair and a bright smile. Something in that image broke through her fear. "Baby," Chloe called out, her voice shaking as she rushed forward. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The 3 men turned, surprise flickering across their faces. Before anyone could react, Chloe wrapped her arms around Caleb, pressing a kiss to his stubbled cheek. He reeked of expensive whiskey and desperation. "Who the hell are you?" the lead enforcer demanded. "His girlfriend," Chloe lied, her pulse racing so fast she thought she might pass out. "And he's coming home with me right now." The men exchanged glances. Killing Caleb Hayes was one thing. Killing a civilian witness would bring heat they couldn't afford. "This isn't over, Hayes," the leader spat. "Tell your new girlfriend she just signed her death warrant." As their footsteps faded into the night, Caleb's bleary eyes focused on Chloe's face. Even intoxicated and broken, there was something sharp in his gaze, something that suggested he was memorizing every detail. "Why would you do something so stupid?" he whispered. Chloe didn't have an answer. She'd just saved the life of a man whose name was synonymous with violence and fear, a man who made people disappear for far less than witnessing his moment of weakness. What Chloe didn't know as she struggled to get Caleb's phone from his pocket to call for help was that across the street, a business associate had witnessed the entire scene, someone who would report back that the infamous Caleb Hayes had been saved by a nobody waitress. And what Caleb didn't know, as his grief-soaked mind tried to process what had just happened, was that this exhausted young woman had just sacrificed the one thing she couldn't afford to lose, her anonymity. "Because everyone deserves help when they're drowning," Chloe finally answered, locating a contact labeled Marcus driver in Caleb's phone. Those words would echo in Caleb Hayes' mind long after the alcohol wore off, setting in motion a series of events that would force both of them to choose between the lives they'd resigned themselves to and the future they never believed they deserved. If you're already enjoying the story, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment letting us know the country where you're watching from. Your support helps us in creating more amazing stories. Marcus arrived in a black Mercedes within 15 minutes, his expression hardening the moment he saw Chloe supporting his boss against the alley wall. He was a mountain of a man, mid-40s, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow and eyes that assessed threats with surgical precision. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, moving to take Caleb from her arms. "Someone who just kept him from getting killed by the Volkovs," Chloe shot back, exhaustion making her bolder than she should have been. "You're welcome." The drive to the Gold Coast was suffocating with tension. Marcus watched Chloe through the rearview mirror like she was a bomb waiting to detonate, while Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words she couldn't make out. When they arrived at the sleek high-rise, Marcus practically carried Caleb to the private elevator, leaving Chloe to follow like an unwanted shadow. The penthouse was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like it at the same time. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering Chicago skyline, expensive furniture arranged with cold precision, everything chrome and glass and utterly soulless. There were no family photos on the walls, no books on the shelves, no evidence that anyone actually lived here. Except for one thing, a framed photograph on the mantel showing a teenage boy with dark hair and a radiant smile, his arm around a young girl who couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, her face lit with pure joy. "I'll take it from here," Marcus said, depositing Caleb on the leather couch. His tone made it clear he wanted Chloe gone. "Fine," Chloe said, already turning toward the door. She'd done her good deed. Time to get back to her own disaster of a life. "Don't leave." Caleb's voice cracked through the silence. Chloe stopped. Marcus scowled but stepped back when Caleb waved him away with a shaking hand. "Please," Caleb added, and something in that single word made it impossible for Chloe to walk out. Marcus left with obvious reluctance, and suddenly Chloe was alone with one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. Caleb sat hunched forward, his head in his hands, shoulders trembling. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and devastated. 8 years ago today, my sister Emma was murdered," he said, his voice raw. "She was 15. I was supposed to protect her after our parents died, but I was too focused on building power, on making sure no one could hurt us. I didn't see the threat until it was too late. The Castellano family took her to get to me, to punish me for taking territory they thought was theirs." The photograph on the mantel suddenly made terrible sense. "I killed every single one of them," Caleb continued, staring at his hands as if he could still see blood on them. "I built an empire on their graves, became the monster I thought would keep everyone else safe. But all I did was create more monsters, more violence, more death. And for what? Emma's still gone. I still failed her." Chloe should have been terrified. Instead, she found herself moving to the kitchen, searching through cabinets until she found coffee. She made a pot without asking, poured 2 cups, and sat down across from him. "My mother died 3 years ago," Chloe heard herself saying.
"Cancer."
"I spent 18 months watching her waste away, holding her hand through chemo that didn't work, lying to her that everything would be okay when we both knew it wouldn't. She left me $87,000 in medical debt and a lifetime of guilt that I couldn't save her no matter how many extra shifts I worked." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition that only people who'd survived drowning could share. "We're both just trying to keep our heads above water," Chloe whispered. For the first time that night, Caleb's expression softened into something almost human. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee as the city lights glittered below them. Chloe was just beginning to think she might actually make it home before sunrise when Caleb's phone erupted with a harsh ringtone that shattered the fragile peace. Caleb glanced at the screen and went pale. "Victor," he muttered, his hand shaking as he reached for the phone. I can't talk to him right now." "Then don't answer," Chloe said. But the phone kept ringing, persistent and demanding. When it finally stopped, it immediately started again. Caleb closed his eyes, and for a moment, he looked like he might be sick. "If I don't answer, he'll think I'm weak. If I do answer like this." He gestured helplessly at himself.
"The deal is dead."
Everything falls apart. The phone rang a third time. Chloe watched Caleb's hand tremble as he stared at it, paralyzed by exhaustion and alcohol and grief. She'd seen that look before. The look of someone who'd reached their absolute limit and had nothing left to give. Without thinking, Chloe grabbed the phone and answered. "Who the hell is this?" A heavily accented voice roared through the speaker. "Where is Hayes?" "I was just informed by a very amused business associate that the great Caleb Hayes was found drunk in an alley, like some pathetic street trash. This is what I'm partnering with? This weakness." "Mr. Morozov," Chloe said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Chloe Jensen. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Hayes because he's currently unable to speak. Unable? Is he that drunk? Victor's laugh was cruel. I'm pulling the shipment. The deal is off. I don't do business with. His mother figure died tonight, Chloe interrupted, the life forming even as she spoke. The woman who raised him and his sister after their parents were killed. She passed away suddenly this evening, and Mr. Hayes was processing that loss. Surely you, as a family man yourself, can understand the weight of such grief. There was a long pause. Caleb stared at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. His mother figure? Victor's tone had shifted, uncertainty creeping in.
Yes.
She was the last connection he had to his childhood, to his sister Emma. Losing her brought back every painful memory. Chloe pressed forward, channeling every ounce of conviction she'd ever needed to convince hospital billing departments to accept payment plans. But Mr. Hayes wanted me to assure you that his personal grief will not affect your partnership. In fact, he's been considering expanding the arrangement, opening additional distribution channels through the South Side territories that would increase your profit margins by at least 30%. She was making it up as she went, but she'd overheard enough of Caleb's earlier rambling to piece together fragments of his business operations. Expanded distribution? Victor's interest was audible. The South Side has been contested territory. Not anymore. Mr. Hayes has consolidated control. He was planning to discuss this with you next week, but given tonight's circumstances and your understandable concerns, I wanted to assure you that his commitment to your partnership remains absolute. He honors family above all else, which is why tonight's loss hit him so hard and why he values partners who understand the importance of loyalty. Another long pause. Chloe could hear Victor breathing, calculating. Tell Hayes I'm sorry for his loss, Victor finally said, his tone completely transformed. Family is everything. We proceed as planned, and I want to hear more about this South Side expansion. Have him call me tomorrow when he's in better condition. Of course. Thank you for your understanding, Mr. Morozov. The line went dead. Chloe set the phone down with shaking hands, only then realizing she'd been holding her breath. Caleb was staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle. You just saved my entire operation, he said slowly. Who are you? Chloe didn't have an answer. She was just a waitress drowning in debt who'd somehow stumbled into the most dangerous night of her life. Caleb insisted she take his bedroom while he crashed on the couch, and she was too exhausted to argue. The last thing she remembered was her head hitting the pillow, the city lights filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. She woke to gray dawn light and the sound of low voices in the living room. Her phone showed 6:47 a.m. She had 13 minutes to get to her morning shift at Rosie's Diner across town. Panic jolted her fully awake. Chloe slipped out of the bedroom to find Marcus standing by the windows, arms crossed, his expression darker than the night before. He tracked her movement with cold eyes as she grabbed her worn jacket from where she'd draped it over a chair. He's still asleep, Marcus said quietly. You should go before he wakes up. It wasn't a suggestion. Chloe nodded, relieved. In the harsh morning light, last night felt like a fever dream, the kind you woke up from hoping no one else remembered. Men like Caleb Hayes didn't want witnesses to their vulnerability. Whatever connection she'd imagined in those dark hours was just exhaustion and circumstance. She was better off forgetting the whole thing ever happened. The L train was crowded with early morning commuters, all of them lost in their phones or their own thoughts. Chloe pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city slide past. By the time she pushed through the door of Rosie's Diner in Pilsen at 7:03 a.m., she'd almost convinced herself it had all been some strange dream. You look like hell, honey, Rosie called from behind the counter, her kind face creased with concern. Long night, Chloe managed, tying on her apron. I'm fine. She fell into the familiar rhythm, coffee refills, breakfast orders, wiping down tables, forcing smiles for customers who barely saw her. This was her real life. Small tips, aching feet, the constant calculation of which bill to pay first. The penthouse and the dangerous man, and the desperate phone call already felt like they belonged to someone else's story. At 8:30 a.m., the door chimed. Chloe glanced up automatically, the coffee pot in her hand, and nearly dropped it. Caleb Hayes stood in the doorway of Rosie's diner, looking like he'd stepped out of a completely different world. Gone was the broken, grief-stricken man from the alley. This version wore a sharp black suit that probably cost more than Chloe made in 6 months, his dark hair styled back, his presence commanding every eye in the room, even though no one knew who he was. He was completely sober, completely in control, and his eyes locked onto Chloe with laser focus. He crossed the diner and sat at her table. Every instinct screamed at her to run. "We need to talk about last night," Caleb said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You saved my life twice, once from the Volkovs, once from myself. That's not a debt I take lightly." Chloe's heart hammered. This was it. The payoff to keep quiet, maybe a threat to ensure her silence. She'd been stupid to think helping him wouldn't have consequences. "I'm offering you a position as my business consultant," Caleb continued, sliding a business card across the table. "Salary of $150,000 a year, benefits, security. You proved last night you have skills I need: quick thinking, negotiation, the ability to see solutions where others see problems." Chloe stared at the card, then at him. "You're serious?" "I don't joke about business. You could clear your debt in months, build a real future. All I'm asking is that you help me do the same." It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Comment which country you're watching from if you believe people stuck in poverty deserve a real chance to escape. Scammers and exploiters who keep people trapped won't comment. "I have conditions," Chloe said, her voice steadier than she felt. The diner buzzed with morning chatter around them, oblivious to the life-altering conversation happening at table 7. "Everything you ask me to do has to be legitimate. Nothing illegal. And if you ever ask me to compromise my morals, I walk. No questions, no explanations." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand across the table. "Deal." The handshake felt like stepping off a cliff. Hayes Enterprises occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, all polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Chloe's first day, wearing a blazer she'd bought at Goodwill and praying it looked professional enough, felt like infiltrating a world that had never been meant for people like her. The receptionist's perfectly manicured nails clicked against her keyboard as she directed Chloe to Caleb's corner office, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes assessing every worn seam of Chloe's outfit. Marcus was waiting outside Caleb's door, arms crossed, his scarred face arranged in what Chloe was beginning to recognize as his permanent scowl. "He's in a meeting with Sophia," he said, not moving aside. "Our attorney. She's going to want to know exactly what qualifies you for this position." "The fact that Caleb hired me," Chloe replied, meeting his stare. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Not quite respect, but maybe the beginning of it. He stepped aside. The meeting room held 3 people. Caleb at the head of the table, a striking woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, and a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a navy suit that couldn't quite hide the shoulder holster underneath. "Chloe Jensen," Sophia said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Your resume says you have 18 months of business school and 3 years of waitressing. Caleb wants to pay you $150,000 to do what, exactly?" "Think," Caleb said simply. "Something this organization desperately needs more of." Over the next 2 weeks, Chloe discovered that Caleb's empire was more complicated than she'd imagined. Yes, there were criminal roots. She wasn't naive enough to believe otherwise. But she also saw legitimate businesses struggling to grow. 3 restaurants that could be profitable with better management, a security consulting firm that actually had corporate clients, real estate holdings that were being used for money laundering when they could generate clean income. "You're using Romano's as a front," Chloe said during her 3rd day, reviewing financial statements in Caleb's office. "But the restaurant itself could be successful if you actually invested in it instead of just running dirty money through it." Caleb looked up from his laptop, surprise crossing his features. "You can see that from the books?" "Anyone can see it. You're paying premium prices for substandard ingredients because your supplier is someone you owe a favor to, not because they're any good. And your kitchen manager is skimming," Look at these inventory reports. They don't match the revenue. James, who'd been standing by the door, laughed.
She's not wrong, boss.
I've been saying Delgado's been robbing you blind for months. Why am I only hearing this now? Caleb's voice was quiet, dangerous. Because Marcus didn't want to admit his cousin was the problem, James said. Then, to Chloe, that alley rescue? I respect that. Not many people would have stepped up. Over late-night strategy sessions, Chloe watched Caleb transform from the controlled businessman to something more human. He'd loosen his tie, run his hands through his hair, and talk about Emma, how she'd wanted to be a teacher, how she'd believed people could change, how her death had turned him into exactly the kind of person she would have been afraid of. I built all this to protect what mattered, he said one night, staring at the Chicago skyline. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what that was. Now I'm just trapped in an empire I don't even want anymore. Chloe set down the financial report she'd been reviewing. Then let's figure out how to set you free. For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Hayes smiled like he actually meant it. Chloe had started noticing the black sedan 3 days ago. Same car, different parking spots, always within sight of Hayes Enterprises. She told herself she was being paranoid, that working for Caleb was making her see threats everywhere. But when she spotted it again outside Rosie's diner during her Saturday morning shift, the unease crystallized into fear. She should have called James. Should have said something to anyone. Instead, she convinced herself she was overreacting and took the L train home alone as dusk settled over Pilsen. The moment she unlocked her apartment door, she knew something was wrong. The air felt disturbed, like someone had just left. Her hands shook as she pushed the door open wider. Her small studio had been torn apart with methodical precision. Drawers yanked open, contents scattered across the floor. Her mattress slashed, stuffing spilling out like entrails. But worse than the destruction were the photographs covering every surface, dozens of them. Chloe walking to work. Chloe at the diner. Chloe leaving Hayes Enterprises. Chloe alone, always alone, in every vulnerable moment of her day. The note was pinned to her bathroom mirror with a knife. Tell Hayes his debts are coming due. You're just the down payment. Her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to call. Caleb answered on the first ring. My apartment, she whispered. They were here. The Volkovs. Don't move. I'm coming. He arrived in 12 minutes with James and 4 men in tactical gear, their presence transforming her shabby building into a war zone. Caleb's face went white when he saw the photographs, his hands clenching into fists as he read the note. The fury radiating off him was so intense that even his own men stepped back. Pack a bag, he said, his voice deadly calm. You're not staying here. Caleb. Pack. A bag. He looked at her then, and beneath the rage, she saw something that terrified her more than the ransacked apartment. Fear. They know where you live. They know your routines. They've been watching you for days, and I didn't protect you. That ends now. The secure apartment was in a high-rise with actual security, cameras, guards who nodded to James with professional recognition. Chloe sat on the pristine couch, still shaking, while Caleb made calls in clipped Russian that sounded like death sentences. The meeting with Dmitry Volkov happened in a neutral warehouse on the south side, surrounded by armed men from both families. Dmitry was older than Chloe expected, mid-50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her like merchandise. The little savior, he said, smiling without warmth. Caleb, you've become sentimental. I remember when you would have burned down half the city for disrespect. Now you negotiate. I'm negotiating because you're still useful, Caleb replied, his voice ice. But touch her again, and I will burn your entire family to the ground. Your children, your grandchildren, everyone who shares your blood. I will make you watch before I kill you last. Dimitri's smile widened. There it is. The old Caleb Hayes. He leaned forward. But threatening me over a woman? She's already made you weak. That alley, I heard about it. You were pathetic, drunk, broken. And now you're willing to start a war over a waitress who happens to have a clever tongue. He laughed. You want my territories because you've lost your edge. I want compensation for what you took from me 5 years ago. We negotiate, yes. But know this, Hayes. She's your weakness, and everyone can see it. Caleb didn't flinch. Then everyone knows exactly what I'll destroy to protect her. Is that the reputation you want to test? The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic. Finally, Dmitri nodded. We talk. But keep your pet on a leash, or next time, I won't leave a note. If you can't stand people like Dmitri Volkov, who terrorize innocent people, hit subscribe. Only predators and cowards targeting the weak won't. 6 weeks of careful negotiations had given Chloe a false sense of security. She'd started to believe the protection detail, the secure apartment, the careful routes between work and home would be enough. She'd forgotten that men like Dmitri Volkov built empires by finding weaknesses others missed. The attack happened at 2:47 p.m. outside Hayes Enterprises, in broad daylight with cameras everywhere and James's hand-picked team surrounding her. 3 vehicles, 12 men, military precision that spoke of expensive planning. The explosion came first, a parked car 2 blocks away that pulled James and half the security team in that direction. Then the vans, the tranquilizer dart that caught her in the neck before she could scream, and the feeling of being lifted as consciousness slipped away. She woke to Tyler's vacant eyes staring at her from across the warehouse floor, a bullet hole in his forehead. The young guard who'd shared photos of his daughter just that morning, dead because he'd tried to protect her. Caleb's phone rang at 3:15 p.m. Dimitri's voice was almost cheerful. I have something that belongs to you. The docks, the South Side territories, and a public acknowledgement that I am your superior, or I send her back in pieces. You come alone, unarmed, to the warehouse on Ashland and 47th. You have 2 hours to decide what matters more, your pride or her life. The Hayes Enterprises conference room erupted into chaos. Marcus slammed his fist on the table, his face flushed with rage. We go in with everything. 20 men, full assault. We burn that warehouse to the ground with Dmitri inside it. They'll kill her the second we breach, James said quietly. Then we make it fast. Boss, you taught us. Never negotiate from weakness. They took one of ours. We take everything from them. Sophia pulled up blueprints on her tablet. There are 3 entry points. If we coordinate.
No.
Caleb's voice cut through the planning like a blade. He was staring at the photograph of Emma on his desk, the one he kept in his office, where only he could see it. His sister's smile, frozen forever at 15, before violence had claimed her. Before he'd become the thing that created more orphans, more grieving brothers, more endless cycles of revenge.
He could storm that warehouse.
He had the men, the weapons, the rage. He could save Chloe and paint the walls with Volkov blood, prove once again that crossing Caleb Hayes meant death. And then what? Dimitri's sons would come for him. His organization would retaliate. More Tylers would die, more families would be destroyed, and he'd be exactly what he'd spent 2 years trying to escape. Or he could choose differently. Marcus, get your team ready, Caleb said, standing. He removed his shoulder holster, placed his gun on the desk. 20 minutes after I go in, if I haven't walked out with Chloe, you bring hell. But I'm going in alone first.
That's suicide, Marcus hissed.
Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way this ends without proving Dmitri right, that I'm nothing but a monster who speaks only in violence. Caleb looked at Emma's photograph one more time. She wouldn't want me to save someone by becoming the thing that killed her. Get in position, Marcus. 20 minutes. The warehouse district was abandoned, industrial buildings gutted, and waiting for demolition. Caleb walked through the rusted door with his hands visible and empty, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, Dmitri stood beside Chloe, who was bound to a chair, blood trailing from her temple but her eyes fierce and alert. Dmitri pressed a gun to her head and smiled. The great Caleb Hayes, finally on his knees. This is how legends die, not in fire, but in surrender. Then let's talk about what happens next, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Dimitri's finger tightened on the trigger, his smile widening. There is no next for you, Hayes. Only submission or death. 8 years ago, my 15-year-old sister was murdered, Caleb said, his eyes never leaving Chloe's face. She was trembling, blood matting her hair, but her gaze held steady on his. The Castellano family took her to punish me for taking territory they thought was theirs. So I killed every single one of them. 43 people dead in 6 months, fathers, sons, brothers. I told myself it was justice, that I was protecting what mattered. A touching story, Dmitri said, but his finger eased slightly on the trigger. It's not a story. It's a warning. Caleb's voice cracked. Because after all that death, Emma was still gone. And I was still alone. And all I'd done was create more orphans, more grieving brothers who would spend their lives plotting revenge against me. I built an empire on corpses and called it protection, but all I really did was prove I was exactly the monster they said I was. He took a step closer, ignoring the way Dimitri's men tensed. You can kill her, Dmitri. And I will burn your family to ash, your sons, your nephews, everyone who carries your name. And then the Sansevskaya will come for me, and my people will retaliate, and the cycle continues until we're all dead or in prison. Our children inheriting blood feuds they didn't start. Our legacies, nothing but graveyards. You threaten me in my own warehouse. Dimitri's laugh was sharp. I'm not threatening. I'm offering you something no one else in the city has the courage to offer, a way out. Caleb spread his hands, showing he had no weapons, no leverage except truth. Combine our territories. Real partnerships in legitimate businesses where we both profit without bloodshed. Construction, security, real estate development that actually builds something instead of just bleeding money through fronts. You have the connections in Eastern Europe I need. I have the political relationships you can't access. Together, we could own this city legally. You're insane, Dmitri said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just exhausted. Exhausted from looking over my shoulder. Exhausted from burying people I care about. Exhausted from being the thing my sister would have been terrified of. Caleb's eyes finally shifted to Dmitri. You have grandchildren, don't you? 2 boys. What legacy are you leaving them? More wars? More paranoia? Or could you imagine handing them something clean, something they could be proud of? The warehouse fell silent except for Chloe's ragged breathing. Dmitri stared at Caleb like he was trying to solve an impossible equation. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, slowly, Dmitri lowered the gun from Chloe's head. You're either the smartest man I've ever met or the biggest fool, he said quietly. We'll find out which. He gestured to his men, who cut Chloe's bonds. She stumbled forward into Caleb's arms, and he caught her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. We negotiate tomorrow, Dmitri continued, his expression unreadable. Real terms, real numbers. But Hayes, if you're playing me, if this is some elaborate trick, I won't just kill you. I'll make you watch everyone you care about die first. I know, Caleb said, holding Chloe tighter. That's why I mean every word. As they walked out of the warehouse together, Chloe whispered against his chest, You gambled everything on him believing you. No, Caleb replied. I gambled everything on becoming someone worth believing. 18 months later, the Chicago skyline looked different to Chloe, or maybe she was just seeing it through different eyes. From the 42nd floor of Hayes Enterprises, she watched the sun set over the city that had almost destroyed them both and marveled at how much could change when people chose to. The transformation hadn't been clean or easy. Marcus left 6 months in, unable to reconcile the man Caleb was becoming with the boss he'd followed for 15 years. They'd shaken hands in Caleb's office, 2 decades of loyalty ending in mutual respect but irreconcilable differences. You're building something good, Marcus had said, his voice rough. It's just not what I know how to protect anymore. Some of the old crew followed him out the door. Others stayed, desperate for a chance to be something other than enforcers and collectors. 2 former soldiers betrayed them in month 8, trying to sell information to the Castellano remnants. James handled it quietly, efficiently, reminder that even legitimate empires needed people who understood violence. But those incidents grew rarer as the new structure solidified. The illegal operations were systematically dismantled, some sold to competitors, others simply shut down and buried in legal paperwork Sofia orchestrated with frightening precision. The money, carefully laundered over months, flowed into ventures that actually built something. Romano's and 2 other restaurants now employed dozens of ex-cons who couldn't get hired elsewhere, giving them a genuine second chance instead of empty promises. Hayes Security Solutions staffed former crew members as bodyguards and consultants for corporate clients who never knew the men protecting them once broke kneecaps for a living. The real estate projects transformed neighborhoods in Pilsen and the South Side, actual investment, not exploitation, creating jobs and homes people could afford. The Volkov partnership proved surprisingly stable. Dimitri's distribution connections in Eastern Europe, combined with Caleb's political relationships and Chloe's business acumen, opened legitimate import-export channels that generated profit without bloodshed. They met quarterly now in conference rooms instead of warehouses, discussing shipping logistics and tax strategies instead of territory disputes. Chloe's official title was Chief Operating Officer, the business cards finally reflecting what she'd been doing since that first day she'd walked through the door in her Goodwill blazer. But the real change was deeper than titles. Their late-night strategy sessions, once focused purely on quarterly projections and legal restructuring, had gradually evolved into something else. Conversations about Emma, the teacher she'd wanted to become, the way she'd believed in redemption even when their world suggested otherwise. Stories about Chloe's mother, her strength through 18 months of treatment, her refusal to let bitterness poison her final days. "She told me the debt didn't matter," Chloe said one night, both of them exhausted after a 16-hour day managing the Romano's expansion. They sat in Caleb's office, tie loosened, shoes kicked off, the city glittering below them. That she'd lived a full life, and I shouldn't let her death define mine. I didn't understand what she meant until I met you. Caleb reached across the desk and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Emma used to say that people aren't defined by their worst moments, they're defined by what they choose to do after. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that would have been impossible 2 years ago. "I think she'd like you. The way you refuse to let anyone write you off as just a waitress or just a poor girl who got lucky. The way you see possibilities where everyone else sees limitations." "I think your mother would be proud of who you've become," Chloe replied softly. "Not the empire builder. The man who chose peace over power." The walls between them had been coming down gradually, brick by brick, late conversation by late conversation, until Chloe couldn't remember exactly when they'd stopped being boss and employee and become something that felt like home. 2 years after that November night in the alley, Chloe walked into Rosie's diner and felt like she was stepping into a different life, one that belonged to someone else entirely. The medical debt had been cleared 18 months ago. Her savings account had numbers she'd once thought were impossible. But more than the money, she'd found purpose, guiding Hayes Enterprises towards something that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. Caleb was already waiting in the same booth where he'd first offered her the job, and the sight of him still made her heart skip. He looked different now, still powerful, still commanding respect when he walked into a room, but the haunted edge had softened. He smiled more easily. The nightmares that used to wake him at 3 a.m. had gradually faded. 3 months ago, they'd visited Emma's grave together, and he'd finally said goodbye without the crushing weight of guilt that had defined him for 8 years. "You're probably wondering why I asked you here," Caleb said as she slid into the booth across from him. "The nostalgia tour?" Chloe teased. "Revisiting the scene of my terrible life choices?" He laughed, then his expression turned serious. "I've been thinking about that night in the alley. You had every reason to walk away, a drunk stranger, dangerous men, nothing but trouble. You had nothing to gain, and everything to lose. But you stayed." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You saw something in me I'd forgotten existed. Something worth saving." "Caleb, let me finish." His thumb traced circles on her palm, the gesture familiar and intimate. "You didn't just save my life, Chloe. You gave me a reason to deserve it. You showed me that power doesn't have to come from fear, that strength can look like choosing peace, that building something real matters more than protecting an empire built on violence. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it. The ring inside wasn't ostentatious or flashy, a simple platinum band with a single diamond that caught the morning light.
Perfect.
"I'm not asking you to save me anymore," Caleb said, his voice steady but his eyes bright with emotion. "I'm asking you to build a life with me, to keep making me better, to keep pushing me toward the man I want to be, to be my partner in everything." Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she whispered, "Yes." 6 months later, they married in a ceremony that would have been unrecognizable to the people they'd been that November night. No power brokers, no rival families forced to attend out of obligation, just 50 people who actually mattered. James stood as Caleb's best man, his usually stern face breaking into a genuine smile. Sophia officiated, her sharp tongue softening into words about redemption and second chances. The reception was held at the Emma Hayes Community Center, the after-school program and job training facility Caleb had built in his sister's name in the heart of Pilsen. As they swayed together on the dance floor, surrounded by friends who'd watched them transform from broken strangers into partners who'd rebuilt each other, Chloe rested her head against Caleb's chest and whispered, "Who knew that the worst night of our lives would lead us home?" Caleb kissed her forehead, holding her closer. "We saved each other. That's all that matters." Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in the twilight, the city that had tried to destroy them both, now the place where they'd finally found what they'd been searching for all along. Not power or escape from debt or revenge for past wounds, but something simpler and infinitely more valuable, a future worth building, together. The photograph from their wedding would sit on Caleb's desk for the rest of his life, right beside the picture of Emma, a reminder that the worst moments don't define us. What defines us is what we choose to build in the aftermath, and who we choose to build it with. Hit subscribe if you believe in second chances and that people can choose to change. Only those who think people are beyond redemption won't subscribe. Comment, "Everyone deserves a chance," if you stand against writing people off forever.